Smoke rose on the ridge east of Jerusalem, close enough for the temple to be seen, far enough for its holiness to be insulted. The stones of the sanctuary still caught the late light. Priests still moved through their duties. The songs of Israel still belonged to the Lord. And yet on the same horizon, on hills claimed by the king himself, altars had been raised for other gods. That is where this question becomes impossible to keep at a safe distance. How did a people shaped by covenant, by law, by memory, by the Exodus, come to this? How did the son of David, builder of the temple, become a man whose marriages pulled his heart apart? And before Solomon, before David, before the kings, why do the scriptures keep returning to households where one man has more than one woman, and where the cost is always measured in grief? The Bible never treats that question as a small one. It does not hide the practice. It does not pretend the patriarchs were simpler than they were. Abraham takes Hagar into his household. Jacob lives inside a marriage built on deception and rivalry. David gathers wives and concubines as kings did across the ancient world. Solomon turns marriage into diplomacy, and diplomacy into compromise. Yet the same Bible opens not with a harem, not with a royal treaty, not with a clan trying to survive, but with a man and a woman joined as one flesh. The tension is there from the first pages. The ideal is clear, the history is not. To understand why polygamy appears in the biblical world, it helps to begin where ancient people actually lived, not where later readers imagine they should have lived. Marriage in the ancient Near East was not only about affection, it was bound to land, inheritance, labor, lineage, survival, and the future of a household. A family without children could lose its place. A woman without male protection in many settings could be exposed to poverty or dependence. Barrenness was not merely sorrow. It could become a social crisis. War, disease, famine, and fragile life expectancy shaped every decision. In such a world, men with wealth or status could gather larger households, and societies often treated that as normal, especially for rulers. But normal is not the same as good. Common is not the same as blessed. That distinction matters. The Bible often records what happened without declaring that what happened was God's desire. Sometimes, the difference between description and approval is the whole moral weight of the story. Scripture is candid enough to let us watch human beings drag fear, ambition, lust, insecurity, and political calculation into the places where covenant was meant to govern them. What emerges is not a celebration of polygamy, but a long record of fracture. That is why the question cannot be answered with one sentence. God did not wake late and forget to forbid what later became inconvenient, nor did he abandon his design and replace it with another. What we find instead is something more demanding and more unsettling. God works with human beings as they are, in hard conditions, inside damaged cultures, while still revealing a pattern that judges those cultures. The law restrains harm where it does not yet erase the practice. The narratives expose the pain where people insist on living below the pattern. The prophets call hearts back to covenant faithfulness. And when Jesus is finally pressed on marriage, he does not start with what had been tolerated. He goes behind tolerance to creation. So the story of polygamy in the Bible is not really a side issue about household customs. It becomes a way of seeing how God deals with human hardness without surrendering the truth. It is a story about concession and calling, patience and judgment, social reality and original design. And it asks a difficult thing of the listener, not simply to ask what was permitted, but to ask what was always meant. Before kings, before concessions, Long before Israel had judges, prophets, or a throne, the Bible gives its first image of marriage in a garden rather than a city. The setting matters. There is no empire in Eden, no inheritance crisis, no dynastic pressure, no need to secure political alliances. There is only the Creator, the human pair, and a union described with unusual simplicity. A man leaves father and mother, holds fast to his wife, and the two become one flesh. The language is spare, but its force is easy to miss if read too quickly. Not one man and many women, not a chain of ranked attachments, two becoming one. That pattern does not mean the rest of Genesis will be tidy. In fact, the disorder arrives fast. By the time the descendants of Adam begin filling the earth, violence has entered human life. And one of the earliest men in Scripture, explicitly associated with multiple wives, is Lamech, a figure marked not by wisdom, but by arrogance and bloodshed. The text does not pause to deliver a formal lecture against him. It simply lets his household stand inside a world, now bent away from creation. The reader is meant to notice the drift. Marriage, like everything else, has been pulled into the wider damage of the fall. As the biblical story moves into the world of clans and herds, marriage takes on economic and social dimensions that modern readers can underestimate. A household was a working unit. Children meant labor, continuity, defense, and the extension of family identity through time. Women entered marriages not as isolated individuals pursuing self-expression, but as members of kin groups whose future depended on land, fertility, and protected status. Love existed, no doubt, but so did pressure. The stakes were painfully material. If a wife remained barren, the problem touched not only private longing, but family survival. If a husband died, a widow's future could become precarious. If a man was wealthy enough to support multiple wives, the culture rarely treated that as a contradiction. The law of Moses later enters that world with an important restraint. It does not present polygamy as an ideal to be sought, yet it addresses situations in which it exists. That is a crucial difference. In Exodus, if a man takes another wife, he is not permitted to reduce the first woman's food, clothing, or marital rights. In Deuteronomy, if a man has two wives and loves one more than the other, he may not cheat the less favored woman's son of his inheritance. Those commands do not sing over polygamy, they fence it. They recognize the vulnerable person inside it and insist that she must not simply be discarded when a husband's desire moves elsewhere. Law here functions as damage control in a hard society. That same pattern appears elsewhere in the Torah. Kings are warned not to multiply wives, because doing so will turn the heart. Even before Israel has a monarchy, the danger is named. The problem is not only quantity, it is what quantity reveals and what it invites. Many wives mean many loyalties, many domestic rivalries, many claims on inheritance, many opportunities for preference, bargaining, jealousy, and divided devotion. The law is realistic enough to address the household that already exists, but clear enough to show that multiplying such households is dangerous. In other words, the Bible's own structure teaches the reader how to think. First comes creation, where marriage is given its shape. Then comes human sin, which disorders desire and power. Then comes law, which enters a fallen society and places limits where damage is already happening. Finally, through story after story, Scripture allows the lived consequences to unfold in full view. If the reader expects a neat slogan, the Bible refuses one. It offers something harder and more honest, an ideal never withdrawn, a concession never glorified, and a historical record that keeps proving why the concession was never enough. That background matters because without it, The patriarchs can look merely inconsistent or merely hypocritical, but they are more than that. They are men of promise, moving through a world that still thinks like the world. Their faith is real, so are their fears. Their covenant with God is real, so is their habit of solving sacred problems with familiar human tools. Nowhere is that clearer than in the first great household crisis of Israel's own story. Sarah, Hagar, and the logic of fear. The promise sounded simple when God spoke it. Abraham would become a great nation. His descendants would be as numerous as the stars. But promises given by God do not always arrive on the timeline preferred by those who receive them. Abraham and Sarah grow older. The land remains uncertain. The body remembers its limits, and the promise of a son begins to press against the one fact Sarah cannot escape. She has borne no child. That detail is easy to sentimentalize, but in the world of the patriarchs, it carried enormous weight. A barren marriage was not only an inward ache, it threatened the future of the household. Who would inherit? Who would preserve the name? Who would embody the promise? In ancient custom, one recognized response to barrenness was the use of a servant woman as a secondary wife or concubine, so that children born through her could strengthen the family line. It was a deeply human solution, practical by the standards of the age, and precisely the sort of solution that appears sensible when faith has grown tired of waiting. So Sarah gives Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to Abraham. The act is legal enough in its setting, but the text tells the story without warmth. Almost immediately, the house begins to split from the inside. Hagar conceives, and her new status changes the air between the two women. Sarah, who initiated the arrangement, now feels dishonored by it. Abraham, who accepted it, acts passive at the very moment a household needs truth and moral clarity. The result is one of the Bible's recurring patterns. A human attempt to help the promise along becomes a source of misery. Hagar is not a symbol in that story. She is a woman with a body, a history, and fear. She flees into the wilderness under harsh treatment. There, in one of Genesis' most striking moments, the God of Abraham meets the servant woman others have used as a solution. He sees her. He names her suffering. He promises that her son too will become a people. Even in a story born from bad judgment, divine attention falls on the vulnerable. That is part of the answer to the larger question. When God works in a broken marital arrangement, He is not endorsing the arrangement. He is refusing to abandon the people crushed inside it. Isaac's eventual birth does not erase the damage, it sharpens it. Two sons now stand near the same promise, one born through the wife, one through the servant. Anxiety becomes rivalry, and rivalry becomes expulsion. Sarah demands that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. Abraham is grieved. The household that hoped to solve a future problem now cannot contain its present one, and once again the wilderness receives the people the house could not bear. What is remarkable is that Genesis never narrates this as a success story of household expansion. Abraham is still the man of faith. Sarah still remains central to the covenant line. Ishmael is still blessed in a different way. But the domestic arrangement itself yields tension, wounded dignity, and separation. The moral texture is unmistakable. What culture treated as an available option becomes, under biblical light, a place where fear competes with trust. This is one reason the question of polygamy cannot be answered by saying, the patriarchs did it, therefore God approved it. The patriarchs also lied, manipulated, favored, and faltered. Their greatness lies not in flawless conduct, but in being drawn, often painfully, into the purposes of God. Scripture honors them without sanitizing them. Abraham believes God, and that faith is counted as righteousness. Abraham also accepts a household arrangement born of impatience, and the consequences are bitter. By the time the story moves to the next generation, the lesson should already be visible. Yet biblical history is not a straight road of quick learning. Human beings repeat what they inherit, especially when the world around them keeps offering the same tools. What begins with barrenness and fear in Abraham's family becomes something even more tangled in the tents of Jacob, where the issue is no longer one additional woman, but an entire household built on rivalry from its first night. 4 mothers in one tent. Jacob's story turns on desire from the start. He loves Rachel. That detail gives the narrative its tenderness, but it also gives it its vulnerability. Love can be exploited when it is stronger than caution, and Laban knows exactly how to use it. Jacob serves 7 years to marry Rachel, and the years seem short because of his love for her. Then the wedding night comes. The veils do their work. The custom of the feast shields the deception, and by morning, Jacob discovers that he has been joined not to Rachel, but to Leah, the older sister. It is one of the most startling reversals in Genesis. The deceiver is deceived. The younger man, who once gained blessing through disguise, now wakes inside a household formed by disguise. Laban appeals to local custom and offers Rachel as well, if Jacob will complete the bridal week and serve another 7 years. Jacob agrees. Just like that, the marriage pattern of creation has become a household of sisters bound to the same man, not by divine design, but by manipulation, convention, and desire too determined to walk away. From that point on, the story does not need editorial comment. The grief is woven into the names, the pregnancies, the silence, and the glances the text never records but clearly expects us to feel. Leah is married, but not loved as Rachel is loved. Rachel is loved, but remains barren for years. Leah bears sons and seems to hope, again and again, that motherhood will finally win her husband's heart. Rachel, unable to bear children, descends into anguish. What the ancient world might call a strong household, Scripture reveals as a wounded one. Then the pattern familiar from Abraham returns. Rachel gives her servant Bilhah to Jacob. Leah, seeing the contest escalate and her own fertility pause, gives Zilpah. Children are born through competition, through bargaining, through a struggle that reaches almost absurd intensity in the episode of the mandrakes, when the sisters negotiate access to Jacob as if dividing the use of a field. The scene is painful because it is so concrete. These are not abstract moral failures. These are evenings, beds, pregnancies, names, and tears. Yet out of this tangled family come the 12 sons of Israel. That fact has sometimes been used to soften the disorder, as though fruitfulness justifies the form that produced it. Genesis does not read that way. God's ability to draw a nation from a fractured household says more about divine faithfulness than about domestic wisdom. The future tribes of Israel are born into jealousy before they ever become a people. The family structure teaches competition, and competition eventually seeks a victim. That victim is Joseph, the son of Rachel, the wife Jacob loved most. Once more, favoritism does what favoritism always does in a divided house. A special robe becomes more than clothing. It becomes visible evidence that the old hierarchy lives on in the father's affections. The brothers read the sign correctly. Joseph is not merely younger, he is attached to the beloved line. Hatred grows. The same household that should have formed brothers in solidarity, instead, produces men who can sit down and eat after throwing one of their own into a pit. When Joseph is sold and Jacob is handed a bloodied garment, the domestic tragedy reaches across generations. A father who once deceived his own father with clothing now receives deceptive clothing from his sons. The house is echoing with its own history. None of this is accidental. The Bible is showing what happens when marriage becomes layered with preference, rivalry, and the unequal worth of women inside one man's house. The damage does not remain among the adults. Children breathe it in and reenact it with greater force. And still, even here, the story remains more complex than simple condemnation. Leah is seen by God. Rachel is remembered by God. Joseph is preserved by God. Out of the betrayal, famine will one day be answered, and a people kept alive. The Lord does not withdraw because the household is disordered. But that is precisely why the reader must learn to distinguish providence from permission. God's presence in a broken arrangement does not make the arrangement whole. It only shows that human disorder cannot finally stop divine purpose. By the time Israel becomes a kingdom, that lesson should be engraved on the memory of the nation. Instead, royal power takes an old household pattern and enlarges it. What had once been clan survival becomes statecraft. What had once been rivalry in tents becomes intrigue in palaces. And when the king is involved, private fracture quickly becomes public danger. A palace full of sons. The move from patriarchs to kings changes the scale of everything. In the age of the judges and early monarchy, marriage is no longer only a family matter. It can become political capital, a sign of status, a web of alliances, a display of power. That is why the warning in Deuteronomy matters so much. Israel's future king is told not to multiply wives, lest his heart turn away. The command appears before the great royal households rise. It is preventative, almost prophetic. The law has already seen where this road goes. David, for all his gifts, walks far down it. He is a poet, warrior, fugitive, king. He can lead armies, write songs of trust, and wait for God in caves. Yet the same man gathers wives in a pattern increasingly common among rulers of the region. Some unions are strategic, some are bound to desire. Some come through the customs of royal life that few kings in the ancient Near East ever questioned. But biblical narrative does question it, not always by direct statement, but by consequence. The House of David is one of the most tragic studies in Scripture because so much strength in public is matched by so much weakness at home. The problem is not that every child of multiple wives is doomed. The problem is that a divided household creates competing maternal lines, layered claims to honor, and a father whose justice can become paralyzed by his own compromises. The palace is full of sons, but not full of peace. That fracture erupts with terrible force in the story of Amnon and Tamar. Amnon, David's eldest son, becomes obsessed with Tamar, his half-sister. The text presents the desire not as romance but as distortion, a hunger fed by entitlement and manipulation. He uses deceit to get her alone, violates her, then turns from craving to contempt. Tamar, who enters the room in obedience, leaves it in humiliation. The entire event exposes a house where proximity does not mean safety and where the king's authority has somehow failed to form moral order among his sons. David hears and is enraged, but the narrative's silence around meaningful punishment is deafening. He does not act in a way that restores justice. Whether grief, guilt, or political calculation restrains him, the result is the same. Absalom, Tamar's full brother, waits. Time passes, the wound does not close. Then Absalom arranges Amnon's death. One crime unanswered becomes another crime planned, and a father's inaction becomes fuel for a son's revenge. From there, the struggle broadens. Absalom is handsome, charismatic, patient, and ambitious. He knows how to stand at the gate and draw wounded hearts toward himself. He builds not only a faction, but a narrative, that the king no longer provides justice. Eventually, he raises rebellion against his own father. David flees Jerusalem barefoot and weeping, a king leaving the city he once established, not because a foreign army breached the walls, but because his own son did. Even the symbolism of Absalom's revolt is soaked in household politics. His public seizure of the royal concubines is not random indecency. In the ancient world, it is a brutal statement of succession, an announcement that the father's authority has been seized and his household claimed. The king's fractured domestic life has become national humiliation, and when Absalom finally dies, suspended between earth and sky, David's cry is not the cry of a ruler managing succession. It is the cry of a father looking at the ruins of a family he never truly governed. The pattern does not end there. Adonijah later exalts himself and attempts to secure the throne while David still lives. Another son, another maternal line, another claim emerging from a crowded royal house. By then, the central point is impossible to miss. Polygamy in the palace does not stay in the palace. It creates instability in succession, rivalry among heirs, and space for violence to grow under ceremonial grandeur. David remains beloved in Israel's memory for good reasons. He is indeed a man after God's own heart, in a profound covenantal sense. But the Bible refuses to let that title become an excuse. The sword does not depart from his house. The line of promise continues, yet it passes through a family that has learned too slowly that multiplying wives multiplies sorrows no crown can control. The 1,000 Marriages of Solomon. If David shows what polygamy can do to a royal family, Solomon shows what it can do to a kingdom. With Solomon, the issue is no longer mostly domestic competition. It becomes geopolitical, liturgical, and civilizational. The son begins with remarkable gifts. He asks for wisdom and receives it. He builds the temple. The kingdom reaches a height of wealth, architecture, and international prestige that Israel had not known before. The world seems to widen around him. In that widened world, marriage becomes policy. Solomon's wives are not only women within a household, they are lines running outward to foreign courts, neighboring peoples, and strategic agreements. In the ancient Near East, royal marriages often sealed relationships between states. A king who married the daughter of another ruler was making more than a romantic choice. He was arranging loyalty, access, and peace. By the standards of empire, this looked intelligent. By the standards of Deuteronomy, it looked dangerous. The text of Kings says it plainly. Solomon loved many foreign women. The warning against multiplying wives had not been vague. It had named the precise risk, that the king's heart would turn. And yet the danger with Solomon is not that he woke one morning and renounced the God of Israel in a single dramatic act. The danger is slower, and for that reason, more recognizable. Accommodation enters by degrees. One marriage may seem manageable. One shrine may seem politically harmless. One gesture of respect to a wife's native worship may seem diplomatic rather than apostate. But compromise grows by the logic of accumulation. This is why the image from the ridge above Jerusalem matters so much. The temple stands in the city of David, the place where the name of the Lord dwells. And near it, because of the king's arrangements, stand altars to deities of other nations, Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Milcom. These are not private curiosities. They are rival claims to worship within sight of the house dedicated to Israel's God. The same ruler who prayed at the temple's dedication now divides sacred space through marital loyalty. The biblical verdict is severe, but its severity is earned by the scale of the betrayal. Solomon's heart is turned, not because women themselves are blamed as though they possessed some mystical force, but because the marriages embody an entire system of divided devotion. Every alliance carries a world with it. Every household addition opens the court further to foreign religious practice. In the end, the issue is not mathematics, it is covenant. A king commanded to embody singular devotion has built a domestic life that trains him in plurality of allegiance. The political effects outlive him. Judgment is pronounced, yet the kingdom is not torn away in Solomon's own day for David's sake. The fracture waits for the next generation. When Rehoboam takes the throne, the people ask for relief from the heavy burdens of Solomon's reign. Advice is given. Pride answers. The kingdom splits. 10 tribes break from the house of David, and the united monarchy becomes a memory. To say the division happened only because of polygamy would be too simple. Taxation mattered. Forced labor mattered. Leadership failure mattered. But the scriptural explanation reaches deeper than administration. The kingdom's rupture is tied to covenant breach, and the breach is tied in part to Solomon's multiplied marriages and the religious compromise they brought into Israel's center. What began as royal abundance ends as national weakening. By this point in the biblical story, the pattern is almost impossible to deny. Abraham's household fractures under the pressure of fear and competing sons. Jacob's family breeds jealousy, bargaining, and betrayal. David's palace becomes a field of violence and rebellion. Solomon's marriages open the door to idolatry and set the stage for division. In each case, the practice exists. In each case, God continues to work. In each case, the consequences remain destructive. The Bible is not building a quiet case for polygamy. It is building a devastating case against trusting it. Something else is changing as the story moves forward. Israel's faith, especially through the prophets, increasingly speaks of covenant with marital imagery in singular terms. The Lord is husband to his people. Idolatry is adultery. Fidelity is not scattered among many loves. Even where history remains messy, the theological imagination keeps pressing toward undivided devotion. By the time later Jewish life develops after exile, monogamy is far more clearly the social norm among the people, though debates over divorce and marriage remain alive. The road back to the beginning is not complete, but it is visible, and in the 1st century, on the edge of another argument about what marriage permits, Jesus will make that road impossible to ignore.